Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, in the earlier lecture we talked about the extremists, and today we will talk about how the Swadeshi movement, which was an important movement in that sense, how the moderates and the extremists, both of them, they became part of the Swadeshi movement. And in the Swadeshi movement, as the word suggests, that there was focus on the Swadeshi goods, and it was also being focused that they have to boycott the foreign products. And Indians at that point of time, the Swadeshi and boycott movement was launched in response to the partition of Bengal, because British, when they divided Bengal into two parts, they realized that Bengal united was some kind of a power, and how if they had to, in a way, attack at the Indian nationalism, if they had to attack at the Indian patriotism, then they had to divide Bengal, and when they will be able to divide Bengal, then they will be able to attack the Indian nationalism in that sense. So with this intention, when Bengal was divided into two parts, we find that the Swadeshi movement was launched by the Indian National Congress, and so many people, they in a way joined the Swadeshi movement. And with the idea of Swadeshi, we find that in the context that the aim of the Swadeshi was in a way provide a lot of support to the indigenous industries, and at the same time, when one will boycott the foreign products, then will also provide some kind of a support to the indigenous industry. As we see that how Indian people, they will also get a lot of work when they will be engaged in their own home industries, and then the Indian products, they will be purchased by the Indian population, then some kind of a thrust will be given to the indigenous industries. And we also see that when bonfires of foreign cloth or foreign liquor or foreign products, they were being organized in different regions, and how they also became popular as well. So when you talk about the Swadeshi movement, we find that how indigenously manufactured commodities, they were being given a lot of emphasis, and both the moderates as well as the extremists, they support this kind of indigenous goods. And this kind of a movement in 1905 with the Swadeshi and boycott movement, we find that this movement was able to generate a lot of mass support in terms of huge participation of the masses. And it was also in a way some kind of a precursor to the Gandhian movements which were launched in the later times. And as we talked about that the way Bengal was divided by the British, and how British, they felt that how when they were trying to divide Bengal, or when they divided Bengal, the reasons were considered to be administrative in nature, as it was considered that the province was administratively unwieldy, it was huge, and when they will divide this huge province into a smaller part, then they will be able to administer the province in a better manner. But it was only one of the excuses, rather, in that sense, that British, which they provided. Their main objective to divide Bengal was in the context of attacking the nationalism which was there in Bengal. So we find that British, they realized that if they will not divide this province, and Bengal being a very huge province at that point of time, because it had modern days Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and we also see the Bangladesh as well. So in that sense, this province was a huge province, and when they will be able to divide this province, then the people, those who were the participants in the movement, in that sense, those who were there mobilizing against the British in the sense of the independence movement, so they will be able to in a way attack them in a certain way, so which was being felt by the British. And the way they tried to divide it, it was also very obvious that how nationalism was to be weakened in that region. And we also see that even the people, those who were there in the government, they admitted that Home Secretary, for example, to the government of India, Risley, he argued that the United Bengal was a powerful and when it will be divided, then its division will weaken Bengal. So in that sense, the realization that how when they will be able to divide Bengal, and then they will be able to reap the benefit in the framework that it will attack the Indian nationalism. So when you see the way the division was affected, we realize that how the Bengali influence was to be reduced by not only putting the Bengalis under the two administrations, but also by making them a minority in Bengal itself, because the new proposal aimed to place 1 crore 70 lakh Bengali and 3 crore 70 lakh Oriya and Hindi speaking people in the province of Bengal proper. So in this way, this idea of reducing the Bengali influence in this region was being undertaken by the British, and this kind of a division which was being seen or was being made by the British was to foster another kind of division that was on the basis of religion. And as we see that British, they were following such kind of a policy of divide and rule, where they wanted to divide people on the basis of religion, region, caste, language. So they had this kind of intention that Indian people, they are not united in any way. And we find that the British officials, they in a way cherished this kind of an idea where Indians are fighting amongst themselves. So Lord Curzon talked about that how Dhaka could be the capital of the new Muslim majority province with 1 crore 80 lakh Muslims and 1 crore 20 lakhs Hindus. So we find that the way this kind of a division was affected was to create Hindu majority in one region and Muslim majority in another region. So that was the intention of the British in terms of attacking the strength of the national movement. And the way we find that the partition of Bengal unfolded and the various events which are related to the Swadeshi movement, they were also in response to this partition, where we find that the way the announcement of this happens on 19 July 1905, and we find that a number of meetings and the protest against the partition, they were being held. And on 7th August 1905, the Swadeshi movement was officially announced, and the famous boycott resolution was also passed at that point of time. And on 1st September 1905, government declared partition will come into effect on 16th October 1905. So we find that this was the kind of changes which were happening from time to time in the framework of the events which were associated with the partition of Bengal. And we find that 16th October 1905 was announced as a day of mourning throughout Bengal and observed as Arandhan, the cooking hearth, where unit at houses as a symbol of mourning. So we find that these cooking hearths, they were not lit at that point of time. They were left unlit. Food was not prepared in them at that point of time, and they were trying to convey as some sort of a symbol of mourning, because only during the morning we do not cook the food in the hearth, and it is being left unlit. So we find that how such kind of a measure which was announced by the British, and how Indians, they responded to this kind of a division, where the Indians realized that these kinds of politics and policies which were followed by the British was not new. Such kind of a division they were doing after the revolt of 1857 as well, and thereafter we also see that the kind of support which they provide to the Muslim League when it emerges in 1906, and thereafter was again one of the reasons of creating the division between both the communities at a greater level. In the context of Swadeshi, we find that how they in a way practiced Raksha Bandhan, where Rakhis, they were being tied on each other's hand, and it conveyed the symbol of brotherhood and unity of both the parts of Bengal. So this kind of a thing was undertaken at that point of time, and we see that how Swadeshi became the avowed objective of the movement as well. And we also have to see that the boycott of the British goods strengthened the forces of Swadeshi, because when the Indians, they are going to boycott the foreign products, then they are going to use the Swadeshi goods. And that is why we find that how everything which was associated with regard to the indigenous industry or indigenous education that was being promoted in the movement. And when one was talking about the indigenous goods, it was considered that when you will promote them, it was the national duty of the masses in that sense. We also see that how organization of the Swadeshi fairs, they were also being done, so that they could also sell the indigenous goods or products which have been made by them. And we also realize that during this time, charkha or the spinning wheel became some sort of a symbol of the concern of the masses for the economic self-sufficiency of the country, because of the fact that when people in their free time, when they will engage themselves in charkha or the spinning wheel, then they will be able to achieve some kind of a self-sufficiency for themselves. They may be able to, in a way, earn some kind of a money, or they will be able to make cloth for themselves. So that way also they will be able to contribute to the national movement as well. We also find that a number of people, they also established a number of industries or enterprises during this time, whether it was Calcutta Potteries, National Tannery, Bengal Chemicals, all of them, they were being opened at that point of time, and various consumer products they were being made in these units, which were made so that these consumer products, they are not being imported from Britain. And on the other hand, we also find that they did not want to consume the British products, and how these British products, they were being burnt by them in the huge bonfires. And a number of women, they actively participated in the bonfires, because many a times we find that bonfires of liquor also happened. Foreign liquor was in a way thrown into the bonfire, and liquor being a commodity which was in a way trying to harm a particular section of society, and how women were the victims of such kind of liquor consumption by their husbands. So we find that many women, they joined such kind of movements where huge bonfires of foreign cloth, liquor, etc. was being done. And we also see that matchboxes, soap, oil mills, etc., a number of units, they were also being established during this point of time. And we see that how when people, they got engaged in terms of boycotting the foreign products, and this was also done within the framework of a number of educational institutions as well, that students, they left colleges and schools which were being run on the British curriculum, and which were being in a way run by the colonial government. And a number of nationalist schools and colleges, they were being opened by the nationalist scholars and nationalist leaders, and many of the nationalist leaders, they were teaching in these schools and colleges at that point of time. And we find that British definitely had to resort in a very violent kind of a manner, or more reactionary in their approach. In one of the circulars called Carlisle Circular, it threatened the student picketers to desist from such activities, otherwise their grants and scholarships would be withdrawn. So such kind of threats, they were being given to the students, and that their grants will not be given to them, or fines will be imposed on them, or they will be rusticated from their institutions. So we find that British, they were as oppressive as they were in the earlier times, and they wanted to in a way control this movement, so that any kind of an idea of patriotism or the ideas associated with the national movement, they may not flourish. We also see during this particular period that how the leaders of the national movement, they were teaching in the various national schools and colleges, because once they boycotted the British schools and colleges, the students, they had to be imparted education in the indigenous medium. And that is how some of the educational institutions like Bengal Technical Institute, Bengal National College and School, all of them, they got opened during this time. And we also see that numerous primary and secondary schools, they were also being opened at this point of time. And when we talk about the kind of traditions which were there in the Swadeshi movement, we see that moderate traditions, constructive Swadeshi on the lines which was suggested by Tagore, passive resistance model, and the revolutionaries. So these were the fourfold distinction which has been examined by Sumit Sarkar in his writings. And we find that when one is trying to understand the movement in that context, then we find that all these kinds of strands or distinctions could be seen, where we see that the moderate traditions in the initial part, and then constructive Swadeshi as Tagore talked in the framework of the Atma Shakti. And then we also find the passive resistance model as well as the revolutionaries. So some of the scholars, they also have seen within the framework of the kind of role which ideology played in terms of the kind of conflict which was there within the movement. And when you talk about the kind of role, then we find that Sumit Sarkar has argued that ideology definitely had some kind of a binding force in the movement, and in that sense he in a way assigns the sovereign role to ideology in explaining the dynamics of conflict within the Swadeshi movement. We also see that during this particular point of time, samitis were also organized, which were a major form of the mass mobilization during the movement. And the important samitis were the Swadesh Bandhav Samiti, Anti-Circular Society, Anushilan. So all these samitis at that point of time became some sort of a vehicle where mass mobilization could take place at this point of time. And when we talk about the kind of activities which were undertaken by them, then we find that they in a way established the arbitration committees to solve the various kinds of disputes. They were also promoting the folk musicians and the artisans to perform on the Swadeshi themes in the regional dialects, so that because these folk musicians and the artisans, they are well versed with the local language, and when they are engaging people in through the folk media, then they were able to communicate the kind of message which they wanted to communicate to the masses. Then we also see the kind of training, physical or moral, which was being provided to the people, those who were part of the these samitis. And a number of schools and craft schools etc., they were also being organized by them, apart from the kind of relief work in which they engaged themselves during the times of famine as well. So as we know that how various kinds of folk forms, they were being used in the various festivals and fairs, for that matter, when they were when these festivals and fairs, they were being organized, and folk forms, they were being used. In Bengal, for example, Jatra, traditional folk theatre form, was used widely in propagating the meaning of Swadeshi. And in other regions we find that the other folk forms, whether Yakshigan for that matter, or Nautanki in other regions of India, and all these folk forms, they were trying to communicate the ideals which were associated with the Swadeshi and the boycott movement. And we see that some of the scholars like Bipin Chandra has argued that the ideologies of samitis had varied range from secularism to religious revivalism, from moderate politics to social reformism, through productive socio-economic and educational programs, and incorporated within their range political extremism as well. So we find that how these samitis, they functioned, and the kind of range in which these samitis functioned, whether the ideas of secularism were there or they were talking about religious revivalism. So all these things, they were there, and in that sense they became quite popular as well, because people from different positions or different thinking, they also joined these samitis. And when we talk about that how moderates, for example, they were part of these agitations at different points of time, but at the same time we find them, they were lukewarm in their response, and therefore over a period of time they lost their popularity as well. And how the extremists, they were able to secure their foothold in that sense. And as we talked about how Rabindranath Tagore talked about the idea of Atma Shakti or constructive Swadeshi, which was being talked about at that point of time, and various kinds of village uplift societies, they were also being established. Educational programs, they were also being established, and it also meant that when you are talking about Atam Shakti, it meant the reasserting of the national dignity, honor and confidence as well. And we see that when India was under the colonial rule, then the extremist leaders, they were trying some kind of a self-government for themselves. They did not want to live under the British paramountcy, but they wanted to delink all British connections and removing the effects of the British connections. So we find that how boycott to be extended from the British products and educational institutions to other fields like colonial administration, law courts and services, that boycott should extend to these regions as well. And so this kind of an approach has been called by Bipin Chandra Pal as a passive resistance. And Aurobindo Ghosh argued for the organized and relentless boycott of the British products, their educational institution, law courts and executive, and social boycott of the supporters of the Raj and civil disobedience of unfair laws. So Aurobindo in a way incorporated some other things as well in terms of the idea of self-government, in terms of boycott. He wanted people to in a way boycott the law courts and the executive, and the social boycott of the supporters of the Raj even. So in that sense we find that boycott had a larger connotation, and in that sense we find that how the various kinds of arts and culture, they also in a way promoted the idea of Swadeshi and boycott as well. And many songs which were composed at this point of time, they were the steering force for the popularization of the Swadeshi movement, and how Rabindranath Tagore's Amar Sonar Bangla was later adopted as the national anthem of Bangladesh in 1971. So we find that songs which were written at that point of time, in that sense they were also used in the later part, and it was also being adopted as the national song by Bangladesh. And we also see that Abhinandranath Tagore, he challenged the authority of the Victorian naturalism over the Indian art and drew encouragement from the prosperous native traditions of Ajanta, Rajput and Mughal paintings. And Nandalal Bose, who left a key impression on Indian art, was the earliest beneficiary of a scholarship presented by the Indian Society of Oriental Art, which was founded in 1907. So we find that when you talk about the extremists in that in the movement, and how the kind of program which they drew, the kind of techniques which they employed, so a large number of people, they were attracted to their program and they actively participated in them, and the social base of the movement expanded. And we find that the Zamindari group, lower middle class in small towns and cities, schools and college students and women who actively participated in picketing and demonstration. So in that sense the social base of the movement broadened, and scholars like Sumit Sarkar, they talk about the failure of the movement in that sense, that the effort to solve a radical agrarian program for drawing into peasants to mobilize peasantry, especially lower rungs. So that was one of the failures of the movement. And secondly, it failed to secure help of the Muslims. So this is how Sumit Sarkar has tried to see the extremist movement or the Swadeshi movement in that sense, in the framework of how it was helmed by the extremist leadership. We also see that how the way the traditional popular customs, festivals, they were being utilized by them, and so this kind of a utilization was in a way rejected by a certain section of society, for that matter, that how it was seen to be communal in nature. Though it may not have those kinds of connotations, it might be religious in nature and it might be cultural as well, but the way it was being projected by the colonial rulers, and how the British, they used their policy of divide and rule in that sense. So it led to such kind of things during this time, and how the British in that sense resorted to all sorts of oppression, the way they wanted to in a way restigate or expel the expulsion of the students take place, how police was beating the people, those who were engaged in the movement, and one of the causes was in the framework of the Surat split of the Congress in 1907, and how the British, they also played an important role, not only in terms of oppressing, but at the same time they imprisoned the major leaders of the movement and they deported them. And that is how we see that over a period of time the movement became weak and declined. But the kind of techniques in the framework of passive resistance, non-violence, non-cooperation, filling the British prisons, constructive work, etc., all of them, they were being utilized in the later times. And we also have to, in a way, understand that mass movement cannot continue for a very long period of time, because masses, they have some kind of an energy or some kind of a tolerance for a very specific period of time, so they cannot go on and on. And we also have to see that how this kind of a movement had a lot of richness in the promise, and various kinds of national energies, they were bursting out in diverse stream of political activity during this time, and a lot of intellectual debate and cultural effervescence was also there. And we also see that there was a feeling of disappointment, even anti-climax, at the blighting of so many hopes when the movement failed in that sense. So they were, in a way, two important features of the Swadeshi movement. But overall, when we try to, in a way, understand the Swadeshi movement, then we realize that how it was able to mobilize the masses, how it provided them awareness, how people, they were being organized, and we also see that it later served as some sort of an inspiration in the national movement for the later generations. So these were the important or the distinctive features of the Swadeshi movement. So with this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.